This is episode 57 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Glyn Jones, the head of Gardens for the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
No, definitely bear baiting and bull baiting. And what they did was they put the mastiff dogs into the pit with the bear or the bull. These were staged animal fights, but really they were completely savage and a bloodbath.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's England, exhibitionism was a popular form of entertainment. Bear baiting would happen inside the same arena as the Globe Theatre's performances. Philip Henslowe, a contemporary of William Shakespeare, kept a diary that included things like lion heads, and elephants were popular gifts to England's monarchs during the 15th and 16th centuries. So what does this mean for William Shakespeare? Well, this week's guest, Peta Tait, is here to help us explore exactly that. Professor Peta Tait is an academic scholar and playwright with an extensive background in theatre, dramatic literature, performance theory, and creative arts. She is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, and her interdisciplinary fields include emotion, body theory, and gender and cultural identity. Professor Tait has authored 6 scholarly books and edited or co-edited 5 anthologies with over 60 other publications. Today, we have invited her to speak with us about several of the animal theories and history of animal exhibitionism that she covers in her book called Fighting Nature. Peta, thank you for being here.
Hi, Cassidy. Thank you for inviting me to contribute to your podcast.
Of course, delighted to have you. So tell us how these exotic and obviously not native animals like lions or elephants, how did they get to England in the first place?
Well, the records are rather sketchy, but we do have the records of gifts that were sent to the king. So that gives us a very clear idea of who came. Well, a reasonably clear idea. So gifts between nations.
So like, you're talking Louis IX, who was giving gifts to Henry III.
I'm actually talking about a very clear historical record of Henry II being given 3 big cats in 1235 by Frederick II. Now, these were called leopards, and so there's some discussion as to whether they were leopards or lions, but I tend to think they might have been leopards because there were 3 lions on the royal coat of arms. And of course, so by the 1100s, the lions were identified with the royal family. And Richard the Lionheart obviously was named in that way. So whether they were leopards or lions is quite a point of discussion.
But they liked them. Like, this was a popular gift. They enjoyed receiving these.
They were prized. This was a very special gift. They were very rare. And, of course, they would have been transported for quite a distance. So the animals came into the trading networks and then were bought as gifts and sent as gifts.
So when they arrived there, were they bred then as for show? I mean, I know that, well, Peta's book focuses on animal shows in England and even touches on some of P.T. Barnum's story about bringing an elephant to the United States. But these kinds of circus acts weren't a new invention for the 19th century. There were animal-based circus acts being performed in England during Shakespeare's lifetime. Is that correct?
Not quite, no, because there was a clear distinction. When I went back through the accounts where we've got strong records, that's the 19th century, The lions and tigers were habituated. But these are highly intelligent animals. They worked out how to respond in their own interests. And after the late 18th century into the 19th century, we've got public menageries. But a tamer in a small cage really only started in 1825. And it's clear that the keeper or the tamer pushed and shoved and handled the animals. What we think of as circus animals were trained acts, and they didn't come in till the late 1880s and 1890s. And the one big difference being that they were generally not touched. So the animals were trained to follow the cues in performance. And you could buy a whole trained act by the late 1890s, with or without the trainer, and just put your own presenter in.
Like a kit of trained animals for, however you wanted to use them.
A lion act. But back in Shakespeare's time, the animals were exhibited and possibly did some movements that looked like tricks. So
that's the distinction, is that it was exhibitionism more than a trained act. And so that's the distinction for the performance.
More than even a tamer act where they were moved around the cage. We'd have more record if this was going on. The records we have really of lions are in the Tower Menagerie in the King's Collection. So even though we know there were exhibited animals, there's very little on what was actually happening there.
Well, now what about Bartholomew Fair? This was a pre-World's Fair exhibition type thing for the City of London. And I thought that started in like the mid-1200s in England, which would have been they would have had exhibition of animals like elephants, unless I could totally be misunderstood.
Dates in the 1100s, and it started really as a kind of selling of fabric, cloth. But by the 1600s, there would have been rope walkers, without a question, performers, and probably animals, and commonly bear acts, because these commonly toured. And the bear would be on a chain. But it's unlikely that there was an elephant, and it's less likely that there was a lion, although it's feasible. And it's possible that we would assume that Shakespeare might have gone to Bartholomew's Fair at least once, if not regularly, but it's probable that he had access to seeing the Tower Menagerie lions at some point.
He would have at least known about it going on, because it was like right in the middle of the city. So he was aware of it. Of course, we can't know for sure if he attended.
Well-connected people did get to attend and view them. And we know that he was very interested in lions. There's 93 references to lions in the plays. But then there's 113 references to bears. And the brown bear was quite common, or a common animal to see exhibited.
By brown bear, are you talking about a grizzly bear?
No, this is a European brown bear.
Okay.
There is 7 mentions of elephants, but I think that gives us an idea of how uncommon the elephant was. And these are in Julius Caesar, and so they're in the Roman, Troilus and Cressida. There's a mention of an elephant place in 12th Night. So this was a less common animal in his framework. There's a mention, of course, of lions, and Richard II, lions make leopards tame, which is not possibly accurate.
Yes, his animalism is a little faulty there, but we do know, though, that Philip Henslow and his many diaries and records that he kept, that the Bear Garden in Southwark, near the Globe, that he was in charge of, they would hold blood sports there, which included bear baiting, but that he also has a record of keeping lions, and this was also lion baiting, which doesn't get talked about as much, I think. Would this have been going on in the same space as Shakespeare's Globe?
No, it's definitely bear baiting and bull baiting. And what they did was they put the mastiff dogs into the pit with the bear or the bull, these were staged animal fights, but really they were completely savage and a bloodbath. But Henslow's son-in-law, the actor Edward Allen, was very successful at staging this fighting. And Daniel Han has a record. The two of them bought the title Masters of the Royal Game, Bears and Bulls. They'd been supplying dogs to the Tower Menagerie. So they became the masters of the fights at the Tower Menagerie.
This was a very official capacity. You're talking they were serving the Queen?
Perhaps it was into James I's rule.
Okay, so under James I. But the top level of government, they were holding a very official position.
Yes, the Queen didn't like to go to the Tower, but James was delighted in the idea of these animal fights. And he did get a new lion. There was a new lion in 1604. So it's these staged fights that Henslow and Allen would have been involved with for the king. Lions were so rare that you couldn't easily procure them for a fight in this way. You could if you were the king, with the resources of the king.
So it might have occurred, but it wasn't done often. Well, what about the bears? I mean, where were they housed when they weren't in performance? What does it mean that he was the manager of these animals?
If you go to the Tower, you can see the remnants of the menagerie even today. And they were quite small enclosures. And there are records of exotic bears being kept there. But generally the bear would have lived as a travelling creature with the person of the family that had the bear, but they were heavily chained, and that was how they were managed.
You touched on this earlier, that for Shakespeare, exhibition of animals involved training the animal to do something specific and then letting it do that thing. And I wonder, when we look at things in Shakespeare's plays, obviously the reference that jumps out is the exit pursued by a bear, but there are other places in Shakespeare's plays, like a chariot that gets pulled by two white bears, for example. Would they have used real animals on stage during performance?
No, highly unlikely.
Okay.
But the animals were symbolic and within culture. And the lion was particularly symbolic, as I indicated, of royal power. And this was because it was a powerful creature, but also one known to rage. And this idea of the unpredictable rage of the king was implicit with the references to the lions. But also the significance of the lion and the king association was as a protector of the nation. So it's more in a symbolic way that Shakespeare was interested in the significance of animals.
Okay. So Philip Henslow having this connection with blood sports and being appointed as an official manager of animals for the king, that's not necessarily an indication that Shakespeare or people like Henslow would have had lion tamers or animal experts on staff as part of their playing company?
It's unlikely, and this is a rather disreputable part of the performance history, and the crossover into theatre is with the people and sometimes with the venue, but the venues tended to be separate. The Puritans wanted the animal fight stopped because they demeaned humans. They weren't so concerned about the animals themselves. There was a belief that animals were physical entities, and the Christian belief was at that time that they didn't have souls. But there's a lovely part in Twelfth Night where Peta Tait and Malvolio have an exchange in which the Greek belief that souls migrate across species, and Thistes says to Malvolio, well, don't go shooting birds in case you kill your grandmother's soul. And of course Malvolio disputes this because he's a Christian. But you like to think that that's a more sympathetic perspective to animals that's coming through. And there's a range of perspectives towards animals in the Shakespearean drama.
I always wondered that, looking back at Shakespeare's history, where the intersection between what we expect today in terms of the treatment of animals, and certainly the ethical treatment of animals, and the idea that, you know, you wouldn't do some of the things that Shakespeare and, bear baiting and things like that would not be allowed in most places today because of the care for the animals. In the absence of that in Shakespeare's society, I wondered if they would have used animals on stage simply because they didn't have the respect for them or the worry for them that we have today to use them in that capacity.
It's possible they could use baby animals because there was a sense of more control over a baby, but the extent to which the animals were bred is difficult to gauge.
So there was still a significant amount of danger that would make it somewhat impractical to have a full-grown bear on stage, and certainly the lions and things like that.
Yes, they were unpredictable because the knowledge was very limited. And the sense that you could, even in the 19th century, when we have what we call the tamer acts, exotic animals were only intermittently brought onto the stage, and there'd be a long gap between appearances because they were not reliably trained in a sense like they were later for the 20th century circuit. So they could be walked through and the limited tricks. And so there's a sense where the knowledge was limited to make this possible. Generally, the more dangerous animals were kept in containment. They would have been exhibited in pens. So the lions were associated with the dog baiting because of James I.
Okay. Now, you mentioned they were kept in pens. Does that mean that the Tower of London and you touched on this earlier, but would that mean that the Tower of London was actually being operated as a kind of public zoo during Shakespeare's lifetime?
It wasn't very public because it was quite expensive. By the time the mid-1600s, if you paid to go, you were paying, I think it was like a quarter of the average worker's wage for one entry. So it was a very expensive.
Wow. Okay.
Yes, it was not open to ordinary people really until the late 18th century when public menageries developed. But those that could afford it, and I'm sure Henslow and Allen worked out that they could charge for people to go and see the animals in the Tower menagerie. But Shakespeare's theatre was really interested in ideas of animals, and it's the language about animals that we have here. Interestingly, because they were associated with emotions, as I've mentioned, and Gail Pastor's written on the way animals and their behaviour were part of the taxonomy of human emotions. It was a way of identifying an emotion, so you could have rage like a lion and fear like a lamb, in the idea of the lamb being put in with the lion. So these were ways of thinking of human emotions. So animals served our thinking and our feeling, and that's very much part of how Shakespeare's depicting animals.
Well, this is really fascinating, the idea of how animals would have been used on stage, and certainly the way that they were being used in the culture around Shakespeare as he's writing some of these metaphoric lines about animals and putting that on stage. Well, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those.
Well, if I couldn't take music with me and I'd take the complete works of Joni Mitchell, I'd really have to take a volume in English of Chekhov's drama, which is my early research work.
That is a wonderful choice for sure. That would keep you busy on a deserted island, I imagine.
Yeah.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
I'm writing a book called Emotion, which is about affect and emotions and mood and theatre. And there's in the first section, there's a part on Twelfth Night. So there is some crossover into Shakespeare.
Always glad to hear that, yeah. Well, that sounds fabulous. Well, Peta, thank you so much for being here and sharing with us some of the history of lions and elephants in England to help us understand William Shakespeare just a little bit better. It's been a delight speaking with you.
Thank you for the interview. It's been very interesting.
To find out where you can learn more about lions, elephants, and polar bears in Shakespeare's England, please be sure to visit the show notes for today's episode. I always pack extra history over there for you guys to take this one step further and really dive into this topic if it's one that interests you.
You'll find all that and more inside the show notes for this week's episode at www.cassidycash.com/episode 57. That's cassidycash.com/EP57. That's it for this week here at That Shakespeare Life. I'm Cassidy Cash, that Shakespeare girl, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.